January 23rd, 1968. The western edge of Quảng Trị Province, where the mountains rise like dark teeth and the air tastes of wet iron. A thin, cold rain drifted across Combat Base Echo, a small hilltop outpost cut into red clay above a valley that never fully brightened. The sky was a low lid of cloud. The jungle below breathed fog into the wire, and the fog carried sound. Distant chopping artillery, a cough of automatic fire, the long, restless murmur of a war that never slept. Sergeant Calvin Madsen stood over an 81mm mortar tube and looked like a man trying to remember a rule while deciding whether it still mattered. Echo was not Khe Sanh, not yet. It was smaller, meaner, easier to forget on maps that prioritized big names. But it sat on a corridor that mattered, routes that fed the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, from the border, routes that Viet Cong, VC, guides knew by scent and shadow. In late '67, the pressure had been building. More probes at night, more mortar registration rounds falling just close enough to promise the next would be closer, more sightings of disciplined movement in the tree line that didn't fit the old guerrilla patterns. The Marines at Echo could feel a larger storm drawing in. Everyone could. Across the north, the war was shifting into something heavier, something that would soon be named in capital letters. Tet. It was the kind of shift you sensed in the way the nights got busier, in the way even the jungle seemed to hold its breath for the next act. The mortar section at Echo lived in a shallow pit, reinforced with rotting timbers and sandbags that never stayed dry. They were 4 men and a machine designed to bend physics. Their work was supposed to be simple and distant. Drop rounds at high angle into grid squares, let the arc do the travel, let the blast do the conversation. They carried their own private knowledge about mortar war, how sound arrived late, how maps lied, how a few degrees on the site could mean 100 yards in the valley. But in the last week, the threat had changed. It started with a single shot at dawn, a crack that sounded like it came from nowhere and everywhere. A Marine on the perimeter dropped without a shout, a neat hole in his throat, the kind of wound that told a story in one sentence. Then another. The base tightened its posture. Patrols went out and came back angry and empty-handed. Listening posts heard movement and then nothing. The snipers, trained, patient, likely NVA, used the fog and the high ground opposite Echo, firing from positions so well cut into the hillside that the jungle itself seemed to protect them. Echo returned fire with rifles and machine guns, stitched the tree line with tracers, called in artillery on suspected ridges. It helped, but not enough. The snipers didn't need to win a firefight. They needed to make the base feel watched. They needed to make every step above sandbag height feel like a mistake. Madsen watched the perimeter through binoculars as the rain drifted. A faint line of smoke appeared in the far tree line, brief, almost polite. A second later, another crack, and a Marine near the north bunker jerked backward, hands going to his face. Men dragged him down behind cover. The shouting was low, controlled, but it carried the kind of fear that spread quietly. The mortar section received the same order they always did. Suppress that ridge. They did what doctrine demanded. They set the bipod, leveled the base plate, planted aiming stakes, laid the tube at a high angle. The gunner, Corporal Rafe Raftery, read the sight and called the deflection. The assistant gunner, Lance Corporal Diaz, adjusted the elevating screw. The ammo man, PFC Wilkes, slid the first round from its tube and checked the fuse with wet fingers. Fire. The round dropped, the tube coughed, and the mortar pit filled with a brief, violent pressure, a thump that reverberated through ribs. The round arced into the fog with a faint, disappearing hiss. Everyone counted in their heads, waiting for the distant bloom. It landed somewhere in the valley with a soft, unimpressive thud of detonation. Too far left, too long. They corrected, fired again, corrected again. The rounds walked across grid squares like blind fingertips. Meanwhile, the sniper fire continued in sharp, surgical intervals. Another Marine down, another scramble, another sense that they were losing a fight they could not even see. Madsen felt the frustration turn into something colder. Mortars were meant for area targets. Snipers were not an area. Snipers were a point, an eye behind a leaf, a barrel in a crack, a breath held until the exact moment. He looked at the map again, then at the ridge through fog that didn't care about grids. "Too close," Raftery muttered. "We keep dropping long." "We're safe," Diaz said. "Angles high, we're doing it by the book." Madsen stared at the book in his mind, not as paper, but as a set of rules written by men who didn't live on a hill in Quảng Trị. He thought about minimum elevations and safety arcs. He thought about baseplate skipping when the tube was lowered too far, about rounds that could tumble and detonate wrong, about shrapnel that didn't care whose uniform it found. He also thought about the Marines on the wire who were being turned into targets one by one. The ridgeline was closer than their normal missions. The snipers weren't deep in the valley. They were inside a pocket of terrain just beyond the wire, working the slope that faced Echo like a mirror. At that range, the mortar's high arc became a problem. The rounds were coming down too steep, landing behind the slope, exploding where the enemy wasn't. Madsen heard another crack. Another man hit. The fog swallowed the shout and returned it as an echo. He leaned down to the mortar tube, then to the sight, then to the men. "We can't reach them like this." Raftery frowned. "We can't do direct lay with this, not with an 81. "It's not direct lay," Madsen said, though he could feel the lie. "It's a different elevation." Diaz looked at him, rainwater on his eyelashes. "Sarge, the minimum's there for a reason." Madsen's voice came out quieter than he expected. "So is the wire." In that moment, Echo's mortar pit was not just a weapons position. It was a decision point. One path stayed inside doctrine and watched more Marines bleed. The other violated rules that existed to keep crews alive. Madsen reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, oil-stained notebook. His own scribbles from training, things instructors had said with warning tones. He flipped to a page where someone had once mentioned forbidden angles, low elevation shots used in emergencies, reduced charges, base plates braced, bipods adjusted, risks acknowledged. It was written like a rumor, not like doctrine. He looked at the ridge again. He pictured a mortar round not falling like rain, but flying like a thrown stone. "Cut the charge," he said. Raftery stared. "What?" "Reduced propellant. 1 increment. We lower the tube. We put it into the slope, not behind it. We aim by eye, not by hope." The pit went still except for the rain. Wilkes held a round thumb on the fuse as if it might hear them. Diaz swallowed. That's the trick they told us never to do." Madsen nodded once. "Then it's forbidden for a reason, which means it works." Another crack from the fog, another man down. Madsen stepped closer to the tube, hands firm on cold metal. "We're going to turn this thing into something it wasn't meant to be." They did not announce it over the radio. There was no request for permission, no neat language for the kind of choice Madsen was making. He knew what a commander would say if asked in daylight under clean skies. Follow procedure. He also knew what commanders said in bunkers at night when procedure had failed. Do what you have to do. The mortar pit became a workshop of quiet violence. Raftery loosened the bipod clamps and adjusted the legs, dropping the tube angle lower than their instincts liked. Diaz worked the elevating screw until the sight picture was almost meaningless. Numbers on a scale that no longer matched what they were doing. Madsen had them shift the base plate slightly, angling it into packed clay so it would bite instead of skid. Wilkes tore open propellant charges with shaking fingers and pulled increments away until the round felt wrong in his hands, lighter in some invisible sense, as if it knew it had been disobedient. They rehearsed the motion without firing. Lower, stabilize, brace. Diaz pressed his shoulder into the bipod like a man leaning into a wind. Raftery sighted not through the optic, but along the tube, using the ridgeline and a dark smear in the fog as reference. Madsen moved behind them, checking their footing, checking their spacing, imagining the worst. a round leaving the tube too slow, tumbling, detonating short, a base plate kick that snapped ankles, shrapnel that would make the forbidden trick into a final lesson. Above them on the wire, the snipers kept working, confident and unhurried. Another shot, then another, like a metronome built from death. Madsen keyed his handset briefly. Echo actual mortars. We're adjusting for closer suppression. Danger close. Stand by. There was a pause. Then the reply, clipped and weary. Copy. Make it count. Make it count. That was permission without being permission. Madsen looked at the ridge, gauging distance by memory of patrol routes and the subtle scale of trees. 200 meters, maybe less to the nearest folds. The enemy was using the reverse slope, firing from positions just below the crest so they could disappear after each shot. High-angle rounds fell behind them. Low-angle rounds might strike the lip, shower the fighting holes with fragmentation, force heads down. "Set it," Madsen said. Raftery's voice was tight. "Tube is low, Sarge. Too low." "Low enough to hit the face," Madsen answered. "Not low enough to kill us." That line was thinner than he wanted to admit. Wilkes slid the first round into the tube. For a half-second, it hesitated, as if friction could be conscience. Then it dropped. The firing pin struck. The tube coughed. The sound was different at low elevation. It wasn't the deep, confident thump of a standard shot. It was sharper, more immediate, the pressure slamming the pit like a door kicked open. The round did not hiss upward into the fog. It flew forward, flat enough that for a fraction of a second Diaz could swear he saw it. An olive shape cutting through mist like a thrown club. They all listened. The detonation came quickly, too quickly, and it came not from the valley floor, but from the ridge face itself. A bright flash punched through fog, followed by a crack and a burst of debris that looked like the hillside spitting. Dirt and leaves flared outward. For a heartbeat, everything on that ridge stopped moving. Then the sniper fire ceased. Not forever, not magically, but it stopped long enough to feel like an intake of breath. Raftery stared at Madsen, eyes wide. "Holy!" "Again," Madsen said, already counting. "Same lay, same charge." They worked like a machine now, not because they were calm, but because fear had been given a direction. Diaz held the bipod steady. Raftery aligned the tube along the same fog-softened notch. Wilkes dropped the next round. Thump, flat flight, quick flash on the ridge, slightly higher. A second later, a different sound rolled back. Screams, muffled by distance and weather, but unmistakable. Echo's perimeter guns opened up immediately, machine guns raking the ridge as if they could now see what they had only felt. The fog lit with tracers. Somewhere, a Marine shouted something that sounded like laughter and relief tangled together. Madsen's section kept firing, walking their impacts with a kind of brutal precision. They were not snipers in the romantic sense. They were not placing a bullet through a scope at a single eye. But at that range, with that low arc, each mortar round could be placed within a small pocket of terrain. Each blast could be made to land on a specific lip, a specific tree line, a specific crack in the slope where a man might hide. The trick was elevation, but it was also discipline. Madsen forced them to do the same things every time. Same stance, same bracing, same timing. He made Diaz call out slight shifts based on the last flash. He made Raftery adjust by hairline degrees, ignoring the useless printed scale and trusting the geometry of the ridge. They became, for those minutes, a team firing explosive projectiles the way a marksman fired rounds. Observe, correct, fire again, confirm. The enemy tried to adapt. After the fourth impact, return fire erupted. AK bursts from the ridge, blind fire into fog toward the mortar pit. Rounds snapped overhead, hitting sandbags and spraying damp grit. One round punched through the side of the pit and clipped Wilkes's sleeve, tearing cloth without cutting skin. He froze for half a second, then kept feeding rounds with trembling hands. Echo's commander called again. "Mortars, you're shaking them. Keep it up, keep it up." But the danger was building. Low-angle mortar fire was inherently more dangerous to the crew. The base plate hammered harder, the tube heated faster. The rounds, flying flatter, could strike intervening branches or unseen wires. A single mislay could send a round into the base's own berm, or into the wire, or worse. Madsen could feel the temptation to rush, to pour rounds until the enemy broke. He forced himself to slow them down. "One at a time," he said. "We don't get sloppy. Sloppy kills us first." On the ridge, a silhouette appeared briefly, a man rising to move, perhaps to flee, perhaps to reposition. Echo's rifle snapped. The figure dropped. The fog swallowed the aftermath. Madsen ordered one more round, higher into the crest line. The detonation punched through the mist like a bright fist. Debris rained. The ridge went silent again. For a long moment there was only rain and the distant metallic clicking of weapons being reloaded. Then, from the perimeter, the unmistakable sound of a Marine yelling into the fog. "They're moving! They're pulling back!" Madsen did not let himself believe it fully. He watched the ridge, waiting for the next crack that would mean the snipers had simply paused. It didn't come. Instead, another sound arrived. Mortar plops from farther out, deeper in the valley. The enemy's own mortars shifting to punish Echo for what had just happened. Rounds began to walk in, exploding in mud, throwing wet shrapnel. The fight was not over. It was changing shape. And now the mortar crew that had just turned into a sniper team was about to become a target. The first enemy mortar round hit the southern edge of Echo at 0917, detonating in a shallow crater that filled instantly with muddy water. The blast threw wet fragments into the air with a sound like a giant slapping a sheet. The second came 30 seconds later, closer, inside the wire near a stack of ammunition boxes. Men dove. Someone screamed for a corpsman. The NVA were not guessing. They were correcting. Madsen felt the hair on his neck lift. The forbidden elevation trick had bought the base breathing room, but it had also revealed the mortar pit's voice in the valley. Every round they had fired was a flare to any enemy forward observer. Here, this is where they are. The enemy mortars began to bracket, searching for the pit with methodical patience. "Shift position," Madsen ordered. "Now, break it down." Raftery looked at him like he'd been asked to abandon a lifeline. The mortar was heavy, the base plate a chunk of steel that hated being moved under fire. But staying was a sentence. They moved with practiced panic. Diaz grabbed the bipod. Wilkes hauled ammunition cans. Raftery and Madsen wrestled the tube free. The pit, so carefully arranged, collapsed into mud and motion. They dragged the base plate up and out, boots slipping, while explosions walked closer. An enemy round hit where they had been moments before, smashing into the mortar pit, tearing sandbags apart, sending timber and wet clay into the air. The concussion punched Madsen in the chest like a fist. He tasted dust and blood. They reached a secondary position, a shallow scrape behind a bunker line, less ideal for high-angle fire, but now the only place with cover. Overhead, their own artillery fired out from Echo, counter-battery attempts that sounded like giant doors slamming. The rain thickened, making smoke cling low. Echo's commander came on the radio, voice clipped but heated. "Mortars, we need you back online. Enemy mortars are chewing us up." Madsen looked at the ridge again. The sniper fire had stopped, but he knew it could start again at any moment, especially if the enemy realized Echo's attention was shifting. He also knew they needed high-angle fire now, standard, doctrinal, safer for the crew, against enemy mortar positions deeper in the valley. The forbidden trick had been a scalpel. Now they needed a hammer. "Set for counter-mortar," Madsen said. "Back to book. Full charge as needed." Raftery nodded, relief and dread mixed. Diaz planted aiming stakes in mud. Wilkes checked fuses with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. They laid the tube properly now, high angle, elevation numbers making sense again. It felt like returning to a language they trusted. They fired. The familiar thump returned, deep and confident. Rounds arced into the fog, toward grid coordinates given by an observer who could barely see through the rain. The enemy mortar fire continued for 10 more minutes, then shifted, then faded, either suppressed or relocated. The base exhaled, but the day refused to let Echo rest. At 13:40, as the rain weakened into mist, the first probe hit the wire. It was not a full assault, no massed wave, no obvious bugles. It was a disciplined push, small units testing weaknesses, perhaps hoping to exploit the confusion of the morning. Trip flares popped, painting the fog in harsh white. Machine guns opened up. Shadows moved at the edge of visibility. The snipers returned too, but now they returned cautiously, firing from farther back, using different angles. The enemy had learned. They would not offer the same ridge face again. Echo's perimeter Marines fought in tight bursts, calling targets, firing into shapes that might be men or might be jungle. The air filled with the flat metallic clatter of M16s and the heavier bark of M60s. Grenades thumped. A flare hissed upward and hung in the mist like a weak star. Madsen's mortar section received a new request. "Can you hit the wire? Danger close." He understood the implication. They needed immediate fire within 50 meters of friendly positions, a job mortars could do, but only with perfect discipline and a willingness to accept the margin of error. Madsen set the crew. He adjusted deflection and elevation carefully. He made them repeat back every number. He watched their hands, their breathing. He could not afford a mistake. They fired illumination first, rounds that burst overhead and washed the wire in harsh light. The fog glowed, revealing movement. Dark forms crouched near the wire cutters, NVA silhouettes moving with low, practiced efficiency. Marines on the perimeter opened up with renewed fury. Then Madsen ordered high explosive, danger, close. The first round landed just outside the wire, detonating with a savage crack. The blast threw dirt and bodies into the air. Enemy bodies, maybe. The second landed slightly farther, walking a line that cut off the probing unit's retreat. The perimeter guns found their targets and shredded them. The probe faltered, then broke, leaving behind the kind of silence that always felt temporary. In the aftermath, Echo counted its wounded. 4 dead from sniper fire and mortar fragments. 11 wounded, some light, some carried away on ponchos with faces too still. The enemy left more blood in the mud near the wire, but the jungle reclaimed it quickly, rain washing evidence into the earth. That night, as the base settled into exhausted watchfulness, Echo's commander visited the mortar section's new position. He crouched under the low bunker roof, rain dripping from his helmet, and looked at Madsen's crew, mud-stained, eyes red, hands blackened from propellant. "I heard what you did this morning," the commander said. Madsen waited, unsure whether the words coming next would be praise or an accusation. The commander's gaze flicked to the mortar tube. "You broke the rules." "Yes, sir," Madsen said simply. A pause. The commander's voice softened, barely audible over rain. "You saved lives." Madsen did not answer, because gratitude in Vietnam always felt like something that could be taken back by the next day's casualty list. Later, in the mortar pit, Raftery leaned close and spoke quietly, as if the jungle might hear. "They're going to write us up for it." Diaz shook his head. "Or court-martial us." Wilkes, younger than the others, stared at his hands. "I saw that ridge explode. I saw them stop shooting. I don't care what they call it." Madsen listened to them and felt the weight of leadership press down in the dark. The forbidden trick had worked because the enemy had offered a geometry that could be punished. It had worked because the crew had held discipline under fear. It had worked because the risk had been embraced with open eyes. But he knew something else too. The trick would become a story, and stories could be dangerous. They could make men chase miracles and forget the razor edge they stood on. Outside, beyond the wire, the jungle made its own plans. Somewhere in that darkness, NVA and Viet Cong listened, watched and adjusted, just as Echo did. The war was never static. It was a living thing, learning, and in the coming days, Echo would learn whether breaking the rules had brought them a reprieve or had simply drawn a sharper kind of attention. Word traveled the way it always did in Vietnam, through radios, through rumors, through the quiet networks of men who needed to believe that skill could still matter. By the end of the week, other positions along the ridgeline were asking about Echo's mortar section. They didn't ask directly, not in official language. They asked sideways in the tone of men trading contraband. "Heard you boys flattened a sniper hide with low angle," someone said over a scratchy net. "Heard you turned your 81 into a rifle." The phrase "forbidden elevation" appeared like a ghost in conversations. It was half joke, half prayer. Everyone in artillery and mortars knew the danger. Minimum elevation existed because physics did not forgive. A mortar shell was stabilized for high-angle flight. Lower it too far and you risked unstable trajectories, short rounds, catastrophic failures. The manuals were written in blood, even if the ink looked clean. But Echo's situation had not been a classroom. It had been a hill where men were dying in pieces. A battalion staff officer arrived 2 weeks later with a clipboard and a face that had never sweated enough. He interviewed Madsen and the crew, taking notes with an expression that tried to remain neutral. He asked about charges removed, angles used, distances estimated. He asked whether they had requested authorization. He asked whether they understood the safety restrictions. Madsen answered with calm honesty. "Yes," he said, and the word carried more weight than the officer's entire clipboard. The officer nodded slowly, as if understanding a thing and approving it were different actions. "This is not doctrine." "No," Madsen said. "You were lucky." Madsen met his eyes. "We were disciplined." The officer did not like that answer, but he wrote something down anyway. In the months that followed, Madsen's crew continued to fight like a mortar section, not like legends. They fired illumination for night patrols. They fired HE on suspected assembly areas. They fired smoke to screen medevac landings when the valley opened its teeth. The sniper team days were not constant. They were a rare alignment of terrain and necessity, yet the memory of that ridge never left them. Raftery began checking the tube's wear more obsessively, running fingers along metal as if it could confess fatigue. Diaz became religious about sight settings, repeating numbers under his breath even when the mission was routine. Wilkes flinched less at the sound of outgoing fire, but more at the sound of incoming, his body learning which thunder meant danger. Madsen watched his men change and felt the familiar guilt of leadership. The trick had saved lives, but it had also rewritten their relationship with rules. Once you broke doctrine and survived, doctrine never felt as absolute again. That could be empowering. It could also be fatal. In May 1968, after Tet had burned itself across cities and headlines, Echo's region remained a grinding war of hills and valleys. The NVA stayed active, disciplined, and stubborn. Viet Cong units moved closer to villages, blending and vanishing, making every patrol a negotiation with the unseen. Mines found boots. Sappers tested wire at night. Mortars fell like sudden rain. During one night attack, the base's perimeter was breached briefly at a shallow point where rain had collapsed part of the wire. A squad fought hand-to-hand in mud, rifle butts and bayonets flashing under flares. Madsen's mortar section fired danger close again, rounds landing so near friendly positions that the shockwave slapped Marines flat. It worked. It also wounded 2 Marines with fragmentation, the kind of harsh math you accepted when the alternative was losing the base. After that night, Madsen sat alone in the mortar pit and stared at the tube, listening to distant jungle movement. He thought about the sniper ridge again. He thought about how the forbidden trick felt clean compared to the messy compromises of the rest of the war. He thought about how men preferred stories where skill saved everyone, because the reality was often skill saving some and luck deciding the rest. Madsen rotated home in late 1968. He left Vietnam with a duffel bag full of damp memories and a body that had learned to wake at the smallest sound. At home, the air felt too dry. The sky felt too open. He took a job at a factory in Minnesota, the kind of place where machines were loud but predictable, where a sound meant what it sounded like. Raftery stayed in longer, re-upped, became an instructor at a mortar training school. He taught young men how to set deflection, how to read a map, how to fire safely. He did not teach the forbidden trick as doctrine, but sometimes, late in the day, when the official lesson was done, he would pull aside a promising gunner and say quietly, "There are things you do only when the alternative is worse. If you ever have to do them slow, do them disciplined, and pray you never have to do them twice." Diaz went home and tried to disappear into ordinary life. He married, had a daughter, and avoided fireworks shows. When people asked him about Vietnam, he talked about rain and heat and food, not about explosions on ridges. The forbidden trick stayed in his mind like a photograph he couldn't throw away. Wilkes, the youngest, had the hardest time. He returned with a nervous energy that didn't fit his small hometown. He bounced between jobs, he drank, he quieted only when he was alone. Years later, at a veterans clinic, he finally said out loud what he had never told anyone, that he had seen a mortar shell fly nearly flat through fog, and that the moment had made him understand how thin the line was between skill and catastrophe. In the official record, Echo's mortar section received commendations for effective fire support under hostile conditions. Madsen's name appeared in a paragraph. The forbidden elevation trick did not. Armies did not like to enshrine rule-breaking even when it worked. It complicated the story of control. But among men who had lived on hills where the fog carried death, the story survived. Not as a brag, not as a myth about turning mortars into rifles. As a lesson about adaptation, about the way Vietnam forced every unit, every crew, every individual to improvise within the thin limits of survival. And as years passed, the story took on a darker hue because it reminded veterans of something they had tried to forget, that they had been pushed into choices that would have been unthinkable in any normal context, and that sometimes those choices were the only reason they came home. The phrase "mortar crew turned into a sniper team" is the kind of line that sounds clean when spoken far from the wire. It fits into the human hunger for a neat transformation, for a moment when ingenuity cuts through chaos and the righteous win. But the truth of Echo's forbidden elevation trick is heavier than the phrase. What happened on that wet hill in January 1968 was not a reinvention of a weapon system. It was a collision between doctrine and terrain, between safety rules and immediate death. Mortars are built to throw violence in arcs. They are area weapons meant to saturate, suppress, and disrupt. Snipers are point weapons, built on patience and precision. Echo's crew did not become snipers in the romantic sense. They became something more Vietnam than either category. Improvisers who forced an imperfect tool into a specific problem because the problem did not respect what the tool was designed to do. The forbidden part mattered. It was forbidden because the cost of being wrong was immediate. A low-angle mortar shot reduces the time of flight, increases the sensitivity to small lay errors, and invites unstable trajectories. It drives more recoil into the baseplate and bipod. It flirts with the physics that keeps the shell stable. It narrows the safety margin until it becomes a thread. And yet war is full of moments where the thread is all you have. Vietnam, in particular, punished rigidity. The enemy learned quickly, NVA units adjusting positions, shifting fire, changing angles. Viet Cong elements blending into villages, then striking from unexpected edges. The jungle itself was adaptive, swallowing trails, hiding movement, muting sound, turning visibility into a privilege rather than a right. In that environment, the units that survived were often the ones that could break their own expectations without breaking their discipline. Echo's mortar crew did not survive because they were reckless. They survived because they were precise in how they were reckless. That distinction is the difference between a story and a lesson. Recklessness is impulse. Discipline is control. Madsen's trick, lowering the tube, cutting the charge, bracing the base plate, was not a wild act. It was a calculated breach of rules under pressure, carried out with repetition and caution, one round at a time. It worked because the crew held themselves to a higher standard even as they stepped outside the standard. This is part of what Vietnam reveals when you look past the headlines. The war was not only fought by grand operations and famous battles, it was fought by small crews on small hills, responding to threats that arrived in fog and left in silence. It was fought in the minutes between a crack of a rifle and the decision to do something you had been told never to do. The moral weight of those decisions did not end when the shooting stopped. For many veterans, stories like Echo's are difficult to tell because they carry an uncomfortable truth. Survival sometimes required choices that would never be approved in peacetime, choices that would be condemned if they failed and quietly tolerated if they succeeded. That ambiguity haunted the men who lived it. It complicated the simple narrative that courage always looks like following orders. Sometimes courage looks like carrying the responsibility for breaking them. And it raises a second, darker reflection. The enemy snipers at Echo were not phantoms. They were soldiers, patient, trained, likely young, operating under their own pressures and their own orders. They were doing what snipers do, shaping behavior through fear, forcing the enemy to stay low, to hesitate, to bleed. When Echo's ridge erupted under low-angle mortar fire, those men died or fled. Their lives ended not in a clean duel, but in an explosion driven by necessity. Vietnam was full of endings like that, sudden, impersonal, shaped by weather and terrain as much as by ideology. In the years after the war, the US military refined mortar doctrine, studied safety margins, formalized training. The forbidden trick remained mostly what it had been, an emergency option, whispered, not celebrated, because once you codify rule-breaking, it stops being a last resort and becomes a habit, and habits get people killed. But among veterans, the story endured because it spoke to something real. It spoke to the feeling of being watched and hunted. It spoke to the desperation of trying to protect friends when the enemy was invisible. It spoke to the moment when a crew refused to accept helplessness, even if the only weapon they had was an ark built for the wrong kind of fight. If you step back far enough, Echo's story becomes a lens on the war itself. Vietnam was a conflict where the battlefield did not stay still. It moved in fog, in rain, in villages, in ridgelines. It demanded improvisation and punished complacency. It made ordinary men into specialists in survival, then sent them home to a world that wanted neat explanations. There aren't neat explanations for a hilltop where a mortar crew lowered a tube into forbidden angles to silence snipers in the fog. There is only the reality of the choice, the discipline under pressure, and the quiet cost that followed them back across the ocean. If you've made it to the end, take a second and consider how many stories like this never made it into official histories. Small crews, small decisions, enormous consequences. If someone in your family served in Vietnam, share what you know about where they were or what unit they were with, if you're comfortable. And if you want more of these immersive, ground-level war stories where doctrine meets desperation, subscribe and stay with us for the next one.